class. If you consider the entire universe throughout all of history, from its very, very beginning, however that may be, if there is one, all the way through its end, however that may happen, again, if there is one. If you consider the entire timeline, in other words, what happens to it? There's a sense in which that thing is changeless. Change, after all, is something that occurs in time. So if you imagine all of time just laid out at once, so to speak, it should be static, unchanging. And if we're considering all of space-time, then there's a sense in which that totality could not move either. If you were to consider the totality of all that there is, in other words, it would seem to be unchanging, timeless, unmoving. Neat idea, right? Well, today we're talking about Parmenides, who had similar ideas. Here's some study guide questions to help us along. 1. Which two ways of inquiry does Parmenides announce? 2. What is the puzzle of non-being Parmenides introduces? 3. How does Parmenides argue you may not know that which is not? How does Parmenides argue that the world never came into being, nor can it pass away? 5. What, according to Parmenides, is the shape and intrinsic character of the world? Alright, that's it for study guide questions. As always, you'll want to follow along with a pad of paper and a pencil or a laptop or something to record the answers as they come up so that you can internalize the information and better learn it. Parmenides, arguably the most metaphysical of the pre-Socratic philosophers, is most famous for the fragments of a poem in which he outlines two ways of inquiry, or two methods of inquiry. One of these paths is labeled that it is, and the other path is labeled that it is not. And as soon as we begin to discuss what these can amount to, we quickly learn that we're talking about existence itself, or what it is to be. Very metaphysical indeed. Let's take a look. Come now, I will tell you, and bring away my story safely when you have heard it. The only ways of inquiry there are for thinking. The one, that it is, and that it is not possible for it not to be, is the path of persuasion, for it attends upon truth. The other, that it is not, and that it is necessary for it not to be, this I point out to you to be a path completely unlearnable. For neither may you know that which is not, for it is not to be accomplished, nor may you declare it. So we are given two possible paths. On one hand, there is the path that attends upon truth, the path that says, it is, and it's not possible for it not to be. The other path, which we are discouraged from, is the path which says, it is not, and it must not be. That second one is completely unlearnable, whereas the first one is the path of persuasion that we're supposed to follow. What are we talking about? Commentators, philosophers, interpreters alike tend to agree that Parmenides is talking about the world as a whole, or the cosmos as a whole, as well as its elements taken generically. Things in the world, things in existence, beings in a single word. Parmenides says there are two ways to go about studying the world. There's the path which says that it is, and it's not possible for it not to be. And there's the path which says it isn't, and it must not be. It is necessary that it not be. what do these paths amount to? So one of the paths focuses on the idea that the world is, the world exists, and beings, taken in general, are. The other path says that beings, taken in general, need not exist, need not be. Let's discuss a bit more closely by looking at some other fragments. First, this idea of the path which is completely unlearnable, the path which says it is not, and it is necessary for it not to be. What is that path exactly? For in no way may this prevail, that things that are not, are. But you, bar your thought from this way of inquiry, and do not let habit born from much experience compel you along this way, to direct your sightless eye and sounding ear and tongue, but judge by reason the heavily contested testing spoken by me. So, we are told not to consider that things which are not are in any sense. What is he talking about? Well, let's consider something that we would say is not. Something that does not exist, like a chimera. That's right, I said it that way. A chimera is a non-existent monster, isn't it? There have never been chimeras. A chimera is this made-up thing. It's not real. It's a being which is not. Furthermore, we can know things about chimeras. We can know that they have 3 heads, and we can know that they have an animated tail, and we can know that they have a fiery breath. Why can't we know things about chimeras? What's wrong with saying that we can know about something which is not? Interestingly enough, Parmenides considers this. Look at this fragment. But gaze upon things which, although absent, are securely present in thought. For you will not cut off what is from clinging to what is, neither being scattered everywhere in every way in order, nor being brought together. We might think, well, the chimera, that is something which is absent. We do not see any chimeras in the world, but present in thought. The chimera is absent, but present in thought. Why isn't that a counterexample to Parmenides' claim that you can't know about things that are not? The answer lies in what follows. For you will not separate what is from clinging to what is. It's helpful to read this in light of the following passage. For the same thing is for thinking and for being. So when you consider the chimera, what are you considering? There's some idea there. And that idea most certainly is. And it's a part of the world. You will not separate it from clinging to the rest of the world that is. And whether you're imagining a bunch of scattered parts, a goat head and a lion head and a snake tail, and you're bringing them together, or you're saying that you're imagining what is not because those things are separated, whatever you're imagining is. The idea is. The parts which are scattered are. The experiences combined in your mind, those are. Whatever is true of your thought is true of being. It is. At least that's one way to take this puzzle. That whenever you attempt to come up with an example of something which is not, Parmenides might say, as a matter of fact, that is something which is. An idea, or an image, or a representation, or a combination of other parts. We, of course, at this point are reading a lot into Parmenides. Parmenides is a figure that's hard not to read into. After all, we're given it is and it is not to start out with. So, this is one proposal. The puzzle of talking about what does not exist has been raised many times in the course of 20th and 21st century metaphysics, perhaps most famously by Willard Van Orman Quine in the essay on what there is, and you can find this kind of argument in Quine about why you cannot talk about what does not exist. It goes like this. First, suppose that chimeras do not exist. Second, if chimeras do not exist, then the word chimera does not refer to anything. It doesn't point to anything. Third, if the word chimera does not point to anything, then the word chimera is meaningless. Fourth, but the word chimera is not meaningless. So, fifth, it must point to something. So, sixth, chimeras must be, in some sense, either as ideas, or as yet-to-be-fitted combinations of other animals, or as something at least. This is, again, one gloss we can take on the path that it is not in Parmenides. All that we have access to is what is. There is no such thing as the world of non-existent objects, or the realm of things that aren't. If there were such a realm, well, it would be, which is to say it would exist, wouldn't it? There's no sense in which saying there are things that don't exist. After all, the phrase there are means there exist, doesn't it? To say some things don't exist, or there are things which don't exist, sounds like you're saying there exist things that don't exist. And that's contradictory nonsense, isn't it? So is the kind of reasoning when you talk about Parmenides and that first path of inquiry. You get a lot of metaphysics about non-existent objects. If you're interested in this puzzle about non-existent objects, you might consider the work, historically, of Alexis Meinong and Meinongianism, and you might also look into Terence Parsons' book, Non-Existent Objects. So much for the path of inquiry that says it is not, and it is necessary for it not to be. What about the other path? Here Parmenides discusses the cosmos in a positive way, discussing what it would have to be like, beyond all appearances. Recall our puzzle about substances that we encountered when talking about Heraclitus. If something is blue relative only to me, but green relative to someone else, and if it's fuzzy relative only to me, and smooth relative to someone else, what is the thing kathauto? What is the thing by itself? Well, Parmenides seems to be giving a theory about what the world is like kathauto. What the world is like all by itself, regardless of how one part might be like relative to another part, but how the whole thing must be. What is the world like? That's what the path of inquiry, which says that it is and it must be, investigates. Let's take a look. There is still left a single story of a way, that it is. On this way there are signs, exceedingly many, that being ungenerated, it is also imperishable, whole, and of a single kind, and unshaken and complete. Nor was it ever, nor will it be, since it is now altogether one, continuous. For what birth will you seek for it? How and from where did it grow? I will not permit you to say or think that it grew from what is not. For if it is not to be said or thought that it is not, what necessity would have stirred it up to grow later rather than earlier, beginning from nothing? Thus it must either fully be or not. This is a very famous argument, usually taken to be an argument for the eternity of the cosmos, an argument for why it cannot come into being at all. Parmenides also uses it as an argument for why the world can never pass away, and we will extend it after giving the first version. Here's the version which says that the world cannot have ever come into being. First, suppose the world had a beginning. Second, then the world was generated from nothing. Third, then some necessity would have stirred it up to grow later rather than earlier, beginning with nothing. Fourth, but ex hypothesi, there can be no such necessity. Fifth, so the world has no beginning. That's the argument. The most interesting premise is right there in 4, that there can be no such necessity. The idea is that suppose the world had a beginning. So there was nothing, and then the world began. Parmenides almost sarcastically asks, what could have happened if there were nothing, so that the world started then and not earlier, or then and not later? What was so important about the world starting then, if all that there was nothing? And when you consider it seriously, there couldn't have been any such thing, right? You can't say that the nothingness was particularly cloudy that day, and so the world started. That would imply that there was something, clouds. You can't say that the nothing was turbulent before the world started to come into being, because again, that implies there was something that could be turbulent. Or at least it implies turbulence. No, if there were really, truly, absolutely, unequivocally nothing, then presumably nothing could have happened to start the world. There could have been no necessity to, as he puts it, stir it up. This is a long-standing argument for influencing the idea that the world was eternal. And prior to maybe the 300s or so, 300 CE, this was taken to be the scientific common sense perspective that the world had no such beginning. Both whether looking at science or looking at theology, you could not say that the world ever started. Anyone who tried to say that would be laughed out of the room, and the people who did the laughing would point to Parmenides. This argument was very influential. When it comes to extending the argument to saying why the world can never pass away, it's worth being very clear about what nothing would mean. Suppose that the world starts to die out of a heat death. One by one, the stars wink out into darkness, and then there's nothing. Well, wait, that's not exactly right. There's residual energy. There's the expanse of space itself. There being space and residual energy and other such things, that's different from there being nothing. So at what point does it become nothing? There's some space, and then nothing. Why there? What is it exactly about the empty space which causes it to go from empty to nothing? What necessity could have stirred it away, so to speak? We might say that there could be no such thing. For if there were, it could have happened a little bit earlier or a little bit later. There's no special reason for the world to go out of existence, ever. Just as there could never be a special reason for it to come into existence. Or at any rate, that seems to be the reasoning that Parmenides is using in this fragment here. So, we have the idea that the world is eternal, that it did not have a beginning, it will not have an end, that it is ungenerated and imperishable. What else does he say? Nor is it divided, since it all is alike. Nor is it any more in any way which would keep it from holding together, or any less, but it is all full of what is. Therefore, it is all continuous, for what is draws near to what is. But unchanging in the limits of great bonds, it is without start or finish, since coming to be and destruction were banished far away, and true conviction drove them off. Remaining the same, in the same, and by itself it lies, and so stays there fixed, for almighty necessity holds it in the bonds of a limit, which pens it in all around, since it is right for what is to be not incomplete. For it is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything. But since there is a furthest limit, it is complete on all sides like the bulk of a well-rounded ball, evenly balanced in every way from the middle, for it must be not at all greater or smaller here than there. What? let's talk about this. So, consider again that universe, that three-part universe we considered when talking about Heraclitus. The bottom third is red relative to the left third and blue relative to the right third. The left third is gold relative to the bottom third, but silver relative to the right third. And the right third is white relative to the bottom third and black relative to the left third. So each third has a color or an appearance relative to the others. But by themselves, by itself, how are the world and its parts? How is it, kathauto, all by itself? Well, it's not any one color, presumably. Those are just how the parts are related to each other. It has no color. Would it be limited in this way or that way? Parmenides thinks it would never have any sort of limit that was arbitrary. There's no reason for it to have an edge here that isn't matched there. And so, in the same way that a circle or a sphere is a perfect shape in that all of its edges are equidistant from one point, no reason to depart further from that point than any other, so must it be, like a sphere. Notice he doesn't say it is a sphere, but like a sphere. The world as a whole, it has no reason to be more one way than another way at any such point in its interior, so the world is one giant undifferentiated sphere. Weird. But if you consider what we were thinking about at the beginning of this talk, what it is you truly imagine if you consider the universe from a God's eye view, consider the entirety of the cosmic timeline all at once as a whole, consider it from outside any particular vantage point in space, and try to consider it without the veil of human concepts involving color or shape. Once you do that, why wouldn't it be the single static unchanging thing that has no arbitrary limits, like a sphere? So is the way to charitably receive Parmenides anyhow. Again, we arrived at these thoughts by focusing on what the world is like kathauto, or what something is like by itself, all by itself, independently of its relations to other things. Again, a powerful theme that's going to pick up steam when we look at Plato in just a bit. Thanks for watching. See you next time.